You now welcome the Prime Minister here. This is not the
Beginning my speech now. Panel, first thing, this is this House believes motion, and so we need to assess or analyze which side brings the net positive for the greatest number of people, right? And so we are going to show you in our speech why this harms specifically the people in the north of Ghana, and then the second thing is on how it harms the entire nation and its sovereignty rights. So now, what do these NGOs look like, or what kind of NGOs are they? Recognize that they are mostly targeted at the agricultural or subsistence part of the northern Ghana, because that's the major occupation that thrives there because of their climate and their soil and how things are over there. And yeah, and so every other thing that is done is based on the basis of the fact that they are subsistence farmers and they are mostly agrarian. So education infrastructure is targeted to these communities, right? And so, and also notice that's how mostly they are foreign corporations within these regions. And the final thing is on how these NGOs have limited resources in terms of capacity as compared to the states. And then they also focus on specific or targeted areas. So an NGO focusing on education, an NGO focusing on probably women empowerment, girl child empowerment, and all these other things. And they are targeted to a specific region within the north and to a specific situation they want to solve. Why the proliferation and how does this look like? We believe that the proliferation has mainly been due to them governments focus on the south. Why? Because of the presence of the capital within the south, and then because of things like trade and movements that fuel production, right? So we have most of our ports in the south connecting us to the rest of the world. Most of our national airports and these things fuel industrialization, they fuel trade and economy generally. And so governments tend to focus them more, and economic and business people also focus more on these regions because they can get economic benefits and help with their production in that regard. We believe the proliferation looks like more NGOs flocking to the north to embark on their charity and their NGO activities. So we do not say aside OG that there's no good that comes from the proliferation there's no good that comes from NGOs wanting to help or support areas that governments have neglected. But I will show you why these harms outweigh the good, and they are something that we should oppose. The first thing is on government's neglect and how our first case is on how it's further pushes for government's neglect. And here's the principled argumentation, right? The social contrast of the fact that these everyone within the state is responsible for choosing or deciding who gets to govern them, and so there exists that kind of relationship and obligation between citizens and the state. So the states are obliged to they necessarily have the duty to improve these areas, right? And so the states are the legitimate actors here. So in terms of legitimacy, the states is the more legitimate actor to carry out these actions. And so what then happens when you have a proliferation of these NGOs in the north? It creates an idea or the illusion that something is being done, and it makes it easy for these governments to relax. Because recognize how African governments generally look like. They are more lax than lackadaisical, do. They any opportunity to further neglect their duties is something that we can highly agree to in today's debate. What this then does is that it leads to a dependence on these NGOs for their survival. Why do we think this is bad? We think this is bad because they have limited resources as compared to the states to embark on large-scale infrastructure that can last long-term and benefit the people. But then the other thing is on how we believe that they are short-lived, right? And these NGOs might not exist in perpetuity as compared to the state, because the state is permanent and will continue to exist even if these NGOs are out, are no longer there. What this then does is that there becomes no safety net for these communities in the north when these NGOs fail, because they have not developed their basic infrastructure and governments have continued to neglect them. But then the other thing then is on the illusion that it creates and how it further moves governments away from accountability. Because as I already mentioned earlier, NGOs don't owe their obligation to these areas, to these regions to do these things, but then governments do. And so lots of times when governments fail to do these things and no one steps in, it's like incentivizes the people to question the government and to come out there like and to be more politically aware, so that they can hold these governments accountable for like failing to carry out their promises and all these things. What then happens is that governments escape this level of accountability, and this also like further encourages them to like neglect these areas, right? Then the other thing is on how the impacts are like short term and they suffer in the long run, because realize the kind of projects they embark on, right? So for example, they do not have the capacity, as I mentioned earlier, to do things on a large scale. So rather than like probably creating a dam, which is very like money intensive to fund these like to help these areas, they will dig wells, or they would like do these things that can help them in the short term. And so at the very end of the day, the very like infrastructure that is relevant for these communities to thrive for a very long time is absent. The other thing then is on foreign influence and soft power, and how we get like there's an infiltration of these foreign ideologies into these areas. Recognize and how there's an infiltration of foreign influence into these northern areas. And so because we see them as they see them as their benefactors, they are more likely to adapt to their ideals, which might be counter to like what the Ghanaian system or what the Ghanaian community necessarily upholds. And so, and they also have your POI.
Why is non-profit support mutually exclusive?
I think Selo do come and handle that, right? Then the other thing, so the infiltration or like the proliferation of these things would now compromise the state's sovereignty, because now these corporations can now like have the ability to influence government policies in that regard that might benefit them. And then the final thing then is on how there's neglect of the impoverished communities within the South and the other areas, because what NGOs see as the region that needs the most help is the North. And so the communities within the South, which are also impoverished, that like might possibly need like the support of the NGOs, are also like left behind, and they're also left behind, and so they do not necessarily have the ability to achieve like maximum utility. We tell you at the very end of the day that although their existence is good and like they do bring some benefits, right? The harms of governments like further neglect, and the harms of governments further neglecting these areas are something that we think are more harmful. We are proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. To kickstart the case on the opposite side, let's welcome the leader of opposition here.
Good evening, everyone. Wow, just totally unrelated, but everybody on the panel is just so beautiful, especially you, Alicia. All right. So, like, is it possible to drop the timer here so I can like have my?
Who wants to do that for you?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, everyone can, but just put it back on there.
No, I'm just I think the biggest problem with opening government is that they sound a lot like NGOs and non-profits are an alternative to government. I think that that's problematic for two reasons. First, because we think that, first, it's just not true. But secondly, when you think of any country in the world, regardless of how developed they are, they still have NGOs to some extent. In countries where government is functional, NGOs still exist. I don't think they show us to any reasonable extent why they are not why they are mutually exclusive and why they cannot coexist within Northern Ghana in and of themselves. I'm going to talk about them, and then I'm going to give you three argumentations. Right. The first piece of argument. Okay, let me talk about that first. The first thing they tell you is that government is focusing on the South. Exactly. That's the problem. We think that government is always going to gravitate towards where they think they have higher political and economic capital. They think that they're able to get and influence people to be able to get more economic returns, they're able to get more donations and those kinds of things from the South. So they're always going to keep on focusing there. In fact, we think that the only reason why NGOs move towards the North is because there are clear gaps in government action. Why is this true? We think that the nature of how NGOs work is that they work by identifying need and servicing the need. It means that if the government had the ability or the willingness or the political will to attempt to even fix those issues in the first place, they will not have NGOs there trying to solve them. The next thing they say is that we create the illusion that something is being done. Panel, listen to this. This is skill. We don't think that NGOs are perfect. We don't think that their existence in the North is great, like 100% perfect. But the way up is this. What happens when the NGOs don't exist? That is the picture I'm going to paint for you. 3 things. First, they agree that these people are lower class people, individuals who struggle with access to basic amenities, education, healthcare infrastructure, and whatnot. They also agree that the government prioritizes the South and has not made significant investments towards them. They also agree that the government is able to weaponize the illusion that something is being done and all of those kinds of things. It means that when that thing stops being done, they don't show any merc as to why government is going to be willing to stand up and now step in. We're going to tell you what that will look like. It looks like children starving. It looks like people not being able to access education. It looks like all of the harms and all of the holes that NGOs currently plug not existing. Let us assume that the existence of NGOs paints the government to look good. The way up for you then is to ask yourself if the government slightly looking good outweighs the harm of people starving, of people being unable to go to school. It is a comparative debate, and that is the way up. But more importantly, on where accountability occurs. The reason why government is able to abdicate and the excuse that government continually makes for why they abdicate their responsibilities in the North lies around the idea that some of these problems are politically complex and are unsolvable. We have things like access to water, access to infrastructure that they describe as politically complex. Oh, there's so much nuance and we cannot fix this. When NGOs go into those places and in some way or form manage to provide solutions that are meaningful to these solutions, it shows that the government is lying. It calls out the hypocrisy in government pretending that these problems cannot be solved. We think that we're able to even enforce more accountability on government in our world. But the next thing you need to understand is on what that looks like for these people. Speaker, we are happy to concede, right, that maybe the existence of so many NGOs, because it's a proliferation, may be bad. In the worst case, where we say that the reason why it is bad is that, why are there so many NGOs and some of them may be redundant? So we think that even if redundancy was an argument that was going to come from here, that the counterfactual, they have to justify how some social capital, remember that NGO is not public funds, it's not government money, it's not private money, how some social capital being put into the redundant funds outweighs the alternative, which is where there is no proliferation. At the end of the day, the next thing they tell you that sounds smart, but isn't, is that, look, that we think that there is, the influence of foreign countries through non-profits, that there is things like the application of soft power and whatnot. 2 problems. The first is that we think that most NGOs do not send white people to Tamale, right? They use local people. It means that they just provide capital and they provide funding to allow for these kinds of things to happen. But secondly, is that we think that if what we have to weigh between is kids dying of kwashiorkor versus some level of foreign proliferation, that again, when you do that weighing, you are going to know what is more important. But more importantly, and this is probably the biggest thing on whether these things are long-term or short-term, we think that there are, we can't say for sure how long these things are going to last, but we can say for sure what is not happening. And what is not happening is government intervening in real time for these people. Again, when you look back at your notes, what you have to do is pick out their harms and weigh it against what that does not look like. Do you have a POI? All right, great. Now this is what you need to know about NGOs in northern Ghana. Right, 3 things. First, they exist to fill gaps that have existed prior, that the government has refused to fix, that the government has not shown any willingness to fix. The second thing you need to know about them is that because of them, right, people now have access to clean drinking water, have access to education, have access to basic infrastructure and learning. But the third thing you need to know is that their existence does not come at a contrast to participation of government in those regions. It means that our world is one that allows that if the Mahama government wants to go today and invest $1 billion in northern Ghana, they can. It means that our world does not prevent them from doing so. We don't think that the justification for why a good act should not be done is because a bad actor is going to benefit or enjoy from it. They have to show why there is a willingness from the Ghanaian government to even make an investment or to even attempt to support them in the first place. Why do we win this debate? The simple and most important thing is scale of impact. We think that all of the things that they talk about may be inconvenient for society. It may be inconvenient that government gets credit for good work that is done by NGOs. But the counterfactual is a world where the impact leads to death, it leads to suffering, it leads to like the exacerbation of harm that the government has allowed to proliferate. But the final thing is the principle. We think that all of the suffering and all of the neglect and abuse that exists in northern Ghana today are the sole responsibility of government inaction. It means that by virtue of their culpability in the creation of these harms, we must not grant them any recourse in terms of saying that we have to provide consideration for how they are perceived in terms of trying to provide solutions for those things at the end of the day. The counterfactual that they have the burden to show us is what a world without this proliferation of NGOs look like. How is suffering mediated? How are we able to reduce the suffering and like the widespread like starvation that happens in those parts of the world? We are always incredibly proud from OO to be for the poor.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now take the final speech from OO Captain. One of the two Prime Minister here.
All right. So starting now. So we would want to establish that we are against the proliferation, but not the existence of NGOs. So I'm going to give you mechanisms as to why this proliferation is existence and why more NGOs are coming into the north for the harms that we will talk about. But first of all, let's engage opening opposition. So the team that stands for the poor. So when they say that, oh, when the NGO stop, people starve, children do not go to school. But the issue here is that when you look at the governmental structure of Ghana, we uphold democracy where elections are not rigged, etc. What it means is that, first of all, should this problem arise where people are starving, people then can vote the government out in that particular regard, especially even when it comes to landmass. The northern region has a lot of landmass, but secondly, you'd realize that they are the population that give birth to a lot of children. They have a lot of youth rising in that particular regard. What it means is that the biggest threat to the existence of government is the ability to be voted out of power, because that is when they do not have the authority and the political will to do a lot of things that they would want to do. The debate here and what we want to establish from opening government is that at a point where we are all citizens of a country, resources shouldn't be not given to us in that particular regard, but rather focusing on other areas, especially when in the northern region, even access to road networks, even getting the foodstuffs from the north to the south, even from the south to the north, is something that is very difficult in that particular regard. At a point where all these particular problems arise, also the proliferation ceases, what then happens is that people then have the obligation, the right to stand up and vote out the government in that particular instance. So in our world, we say poor people are able to hold the government accountable, because at a point where there's proliferation, there is an illusion that the government is doing something, especially when that particular illusion is not necessarily solving all the problems that are faced by these particular individuals in the northern region. We think just that illusion that, oh, we are doing something, and this is why that illusion exists. So for example, an NGO builds a school, he hands it over to the government claims that, oh, I built this particular school, neglecting the funds, neglecting the taxes that these individuals pay. We think that is something very problematic on their side. But then again, let's analyze the unique nature of the savannah or the northern region of Ghana. So first of all, they have a lot of sunshine. Secondly, they have unique soil, which is good for the growth of cereals, important fruits like tomato, shea, baobab, rosewood, etc. But the third unique nature of the savannah is the high population that they have. Why is this very important? This is very important because this would be important when we look at the nature of the NGOs that necessarily exist. Every NGO would want to solve a problem, and with their intention, but to solve a problem, you don't just pump money or resources into to solve this particular problem, but you do a research. The importance of research is information gathering. And why is the data of the population of the people in the northern region in the hands of NGOs very problematic or very harmful than the good that they are going to do for you? First off, the outcome of the research means that this particular the outcome of the research are the researcher's intellectual property. The reason why this is very important is because at the end of it all, governments do not have access to this particular information. But secondly, because of the likelihood of influence of foreign powers or the soft powers of foreigners into this particular NGOs, what it means is that foreign states now have access to the data of these particular individuals in that particular instance. At a point where this information becomes the intellectual property of these particular researchers, government do not have control. And at a point where government do not have control, we can trickle it down to the independent sovereignty of the government to be able to control its people and the kind of choices that they make in that particular regard. But the second thing is the shunning of responsibilities, which I've already explained. But one thing we need to understand is that this allows people to evade the accountability that exists in this particular structure. But why is this true? This is true because of how the recent Public Accountability Committee probe, where millions of Ghana cedis for the region were not used but they were diverted by public officials for corrupt practices. The issue here is that even when these particular probes are done, these individuals are not punished in that particular regard because NGOs are covering up for this particular development or infrastructure, which means that it is just a cycle of issues, a cycle of corruption that is existent in these particular places. At a point where this proliferation do not exist, what it means is that there is a lot of need where there's an obligation on government to act to solve this particular needs in that instance. At the point where you don't work to solve this particular needs, we think that it is justified for the people to vote you out. But before I move out here,
agree that this is not happening as a vote out bad government. This happens after the fact, after the suffering. We're able to mitigate the suffering right now.
But even in the presence or even before the suffering, they can go on protest and they can disrupt the social cohesion that exists in this particular environment. Even especially when also in the northern part of Ghana, there is some form of conflict between the Bokos around chieftaincy issues, etc. Even though at a point where these particular regions are very volatile in that particular regard, even going on demonstration, wild demonstration is even a bigger threat to the government. We think the people can necessarily do what they want in that respect. But the last thing you need to get from us and understand from our speech is how at a point where these NGOs, especially when they are non-profits, but government regulations on them are also very little or very less because they come with the idea, they come with the motive that, oh, we are here to do good. At a point where these particular regulations are restricted and limited, it means that when individuals or citizens' information gathering, especially for the research to solve the problems that they are talking about, do not necessarily exist, we think that becomes a very big problem and a very big harm to the individuals at a point where data and privacy issues of these individuals is something that we need to prioritize, especially when also they are poor, they are vulnerable to these people because, oh, we are here to save you, your government is not helping you in that particular regard, so we are even likely to give them everything that they need in that particular respect. At this particular instance, first of all, the information of our citizens, especially in the north, is in jeopardy. Secondly, we are also not receiving the outcome of the taxes that we pay as individuals. But lastly, we are not able to hold these public officials accountable. Proud.
Thank you very much for that speech. To end the cases for the opposition,
Okay. All right, I'll be starting my. Okay. Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The only reasonable argument you get from these guys, which is not even so reasonable, is the idea of data privacy and why the proliferation of NGOs makes people's data vulnerable. Recognize that this is not an arm that's mutually exclusive. Ghanaian government already sells your data in exchange for things like aid. Trust me, they are more than willing to sell Tamale's data to the highest bidder if it means they get some form of investment in the agricultural sector. But the second thing on that is that we tell you that proliferation would even make data privacy laws, like data privacy issues, a bit easier to solve. Why? Because recognize the comparative on their side is you have few NGOs existing, which means only a few have this data within hands. So it means that only a few, that for any foreign power that want to lobby NGOs, they only have to lobby a few to be able to get data of all the people in the northern region. At the point where you have massive proliferation, it means so many much people are in control. It is very much harder for foreign powers to do that level of lobbying. The second thing they talk about is accountability. And it's starting to look like accountability is now the newest buzzword because they actually show no way in which you can hold government accountable. Because recognize, the reason this panel, the northern region didn't just become poor. They've been poor even right from independence. So it means for every single 4 years since Ghana got independence, these guys have failed to vote out the government that is necessarily harming them. What does that tell you? That they lack the political leverage themselves to be able to hold this government accountable. But secondly, the external individuals who are supposed to hold them accountable don't even care. We say that the idea that these guys can vote the government out is one that is false, because if they could do that, they would have done that long before the proliferation of NGOs. Because recognize this is not something that has existed before the dawn of time. The proliferation of NGOs is something that is recent, which means if these guys had the political power to be able to change their own destiny and vote better government, they would have been able to do that. The very fact that we still have very much bad government ruling these people is proof that they cannot do that. The second thing they say on accountability is you need to ensure that government is going to do its job. We tell you that one, these people do not have the political leverage to do that. But secondly, you can hold government accountable while still very much ensuring that people are surviving. Recognize that the whole claim of accountability is very much even better on our own side. Why? One, we think that NGOs necessarily bring visibility, and the more NGOs you have, the better visibility you have. Why is this true? Because recognize that foreign bodies are not just people, like NGOs are not just people who do things in private. So they're not just people who do things. Sure, we can even agree that maybe they're not people who do things for the greater good. These are people who do things and publish it, right? They gather data to necessarily publish reports. Because of them, the world and people who do not even exist within Tamale and the northern region are able to have an idea of what happens. The reason why our own world is better is when you have a multitude of NGOs reporting similar problems within similar regions, you get better visibility. And recognize, I already characterized to you as to how people within those particular regions cannot hold government accountable. We think when you broadcast their problems to the external people, it is so much better. Even if those people cannot hold government accountable, those people, because of the fact that, people love to necessarily do things like NGO and stuff, they have an incentive to want to go there because they realize that is a need-based, that is a place with so many more needs that can necessarily be fixed. What exactly do we tell you and why do we win these guys? We tell you a couple of things, right? That the reason why there is a proliferation of NGOs is that it's also very much need-based, which means that several NGOs would not flood into a certain market if they felt that there was not enough demand to meet what they're bringing. The reason why this is important is because our own world is one that is then better. Because like I said, the comparative on their own world is very few NGOs existing. And the problem is that just like they said, NGOs have very limited resources, which means that if the government who makes in billions of dollars every year could not fix the problem, trust me, it's not NGOs who get a few $1,000s here and there that are going to fix the entire problem. We tell you the more NGOs you have operating in an area, the more widespread the benefits are as opposed to their world. So we say at that point in time, you've particularly done more good than you've done harm. What's the POI?
Yes, a lot's question still stands. Why is it that when things get so bad for people, they will not rise up in arms and force the state to respond?
Panel, I want you to think of how long Ghanaian has gotten independence. I've forgotten the year, and minus it by 2026. That tells you just how long these people have been in oppression. And this is why their case doesn't make sense, because they say let people keep on dying, so that when they die enough, right, and they get aggrieved, they're going to rise up and stand against the government. Panel, that makes no sense. We don't think that we would rather have children die and people suffer and our agricultural systems crumble just so people can become aggrieved. We tell you that there are several ways we can still motivate people to fight without necessarily leaving them to die of starvation. The second thing we tell you is on how you're essentially able to break the cycle of dependency that exists in those kind of regions. Why is this true? We tell you that just like their characterization, right,
these people don't just go there and give things like food and stuff. They provide education. Like they said, they maybe build wells, right, which allows farmers water their crops and all those kind of things. Those little benefits you give them, and ones that allow these guys expand their farming activities and whatever other activities they engage in, which means to a very large extent, you give them more sustenance, which at the end of the day reduce the level at which they would come to rely on NGOs. Because like I said, NGO resources are limited, which means you have to be able to maximize the benefit you get from them. You need them to be very much within a particular area. At the point where you have several operating in a particular area, it means more people are getting things that would make them a lot more independent on their own ends. The more independent people get, the less they're likely to necessarily rely on things like NGO, right? But the second thing on why we think it is good and why we think the proliferation is something that helps these guys, recognize that NGOs also do things like compete for funding. And how exactly do they position themselves as the best NGOs for funding? We say it's by proving what they've done with the little funds they have, which means that even if they want to come and argue that, oh, some of them are corrupt and stuff, these are guys who have people who give them money and they have to report to. But beyond those people who give them money, they have other people who they want to collect money for, so they need to essentially do a good job. The reason why the proliferation is then good is that at that point in time, it's no longer 1, 2, 3 people vying for the same amount of money. It's 20, 30 NGOs vying for the same amount of limited resources and trying to get the same amount of grants, which means you force a competition between these guys, and these guys then try to necessarily outdo each other, because the better you are as an NGO, the more likely you're going to get international recognition, and the more likely it is that you're going to be able, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to do better. Just like Raymond tells you, panel, this is not about NGO good, NGO bad. It is about that. We could probably go all day and tell you why NGOs are good and why NGOs are bad. It's simple. Does the existence of so many NGOs within the northern region benefit these guys more than the army is doing? The only arm these guys have been able to show is, oh, you will not hold government accountable. We've shown you how these people do not even have the capacity to hold government accountable. But secondly, you can hold government accountable. External actors, when they get visibility because of the things happening, can hold them accountable. The second thing they say is, oh, right, data privacy. We told you how data privacy is much better in our world, because now the data is not concentrated within only a few NGOs, but rather something that is wildly spread out. But the very reason why we win this debate is we show you that we better preserve lives, right, very much better on our own side. We tell you that our own side likely breaks the cycle of dependency, because you have so much like resources being pumped into these places, allowing them to become more independent. The third thing we tell you guys, if they have better visibility, but fourthly, the competition that happens among NGOs is one that largely benefits these guys. We're proud to come from opening.
Thank you very much for that speech. That brings us to the end of the opening. Please start the business of the person out and call on the member of our board again.
Right, sorry. Let's go. Starting my speech. Yeah, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, there's a certain website, I've forgotten the link, right? But there's a certain website which tells the story of this particular motion. It literally shows you a distribution of NGOs all around Ghana, and it's a ludicrous amount of concentration which finds itself in these particular spaces in the north. It's crazy. So many NGOs concentrated in these particular spaces. What I'm going to do from closing government is to prove the manifestation of the proliferation of these things to you in status quo, and how that affects the way individual actors
as well as the state interact with these places in the first place. This is significantly different from Cellulose and AC because their analysis is to say that the government neglects these places. Within government have things like consolidated funds which are allocated for things like district assemblies all around the country. There are parliamentarians in this particular regard who have incentives to not neglect. You cannot neglect a place. What we tell you is that as a result of these proliferations, the way the government effort in these particular places manifesting in itself is extremely harmful, and that's a bad thing. That is how we are going to win this debate in the first place. Let's start. We think that there are two mechanisms for which these things particularly happen. The proliferation of NGOs in northern Ghana has created a specific niche of the northern industry, and this manifests in two ways. Firstly, externally, they view this, the whole Ghana, like the vast majority of places in Ghana, view these spaces as places that primarily need assistance. You know how this manifests? It manifests as a dumping ground for things like individual second-hand clothes. It manifests as a dumping ground for faulty appliances which they no longer need in a particular regard, because they think of these individuals as places that need handouts and not places that significantly could do with anything else. What is the alternative? And what is what they miss out in this particular regard? It means that people are less likely to view northern Ghana as a place that is worthy of their investment. You know why? Because the way these things proliferate, do things like social media campaigns, posting pictures of the poor girls and the poor women. The vast majority of people think individuals in these particular spaces are poor and cannot afford any sort of thing in this particular regard. Implication: they view these individuals and perceive them as individuals with things like low purchase needs. Because the way the government now applies and appeals to these people is not what AC says. It's not that they no longer mind you, because like I've told you, there's funding for these things. But that they think that the best way to help these individuals is to give them things like handouts, do things like give the scholarships for girls to come and study in Accra, give opportunities for people to get out of the poverty. It is never things like building scholarships, building factories, building all of these things, because they don't think these people can afford the results of these things in the first place. Closely.
Investment comes into it just because they are profitable to corporations. I only go to the north when there's no oil. They're based on their...
What the hell? Who told you there's no oil in the north? You know where it comes. Look, Pano, let's pay attention to this. Investments come when they view your economy as viable enough to support their profit-generating incentive. Maybe there are other things, like a virtue signaling incentive. But insofar as the basic incentive of being able to generate income is not there, because businesses view you as having a low capacity to purchase, then they don't invest in these spaces. Unless you can prove to me that there's a business out there who doesn't care about money, I'm able to prove that the vast majority of businesses care about these things. I'll take you later. The next thing is internal, in the way in which it's manifests, because these people themselves have been predisposed to narratives that the best way to make it out of this system is to get some NGO who will fund you, is to get some NGO who will give you an opportunity to go and study somewhere in Ghana, somewhere in Africa, or somewhere outside the world. You know how this manifests? They crack these systems. They see how to establish themselves as being very poor people, to be able to apply for things like scholarships and leave these places in the first place, because that's the thing that they see happening all around them. Not to spend that insofar as you grow up seeing something all the time, NGOs giving opportunities to schools, etc., that is the best outcome that you are predisposed to. Impact here: one, that these people do not pursue any form of things like capital accumulation, things like starting businesses, because they don't see these things as things that are specifically popular in that particular regard where they come from. The implication is extremely simple. You make these places not like a welfare state, not just in the minds of the people outside, but in the minds of the people internally, and that affects their incentive to do things like create businesses, and that affects their ability to generate wealth for themselves or to get themselves out of the grasp of poverty. The next argumentation here is extremely simple. It's the incentive of these individuals or of the most important actors in this particular debate. There are two structural actors in the proliferation and operation of NGOs. Let me take a PY.
All right, long before this proliferation, investors and governments would have invested, but they did not. Where does the incentive exist? They did not do that then.
He said businesses. He said they could have invested. The proliferation didn't start today. The point is, I've proven to you mechanistically why these things will not happen. They cannot break that by saying it would have happened. Let's move on. There are two structural actors in the operation of non-governmental organizations. The first are owners, heads, founders of these NGOs. These are sometimes corporations. What do these individuals benefit from owning NGOs? Things like virtue signaling. That looks like Devon's tomato paste, setting up a Happy Sunshine education fund so that they could look good and capture the market much more. Two, the branches who carry out the activities of these NGOs. These look like people who have been employed, workers. What do they get from participating in these NGOs? Things like employment, things like allowances, things like being able to get salaries, etc. But finally, even within these individuals, interns, etc., who do these things for the sake of their CVs, who for the sake of experiences for LinkedIn because they get something from it. There's every incentive in this particular regard to be tokenistic in their activities. You know why? Because the very existence of the problem benefits them because of the very narratives that I've explained to you. Three things. Why? Because it's expensive, they have limited resources, they don't have any incentive to solve the problems structurally.
Thank you very much for that speech. We call on the member of opposition to kickstart the case for the opposition to get here.
Okay, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with debates, especially in the African circuit, is when people hear things like NGO, the first thing that comes to their mind is only aid and welfare. Unfortunately, that is not the entire scope of NGOs and how they function. 1 acre fund, for goodness sake, is an NGO. It has created more job opportunities for millions of people across Africa. What that means is that these guys can't claim that NGOs would make the place unfavorable for investment because they are giving handouts to people. There are different natures to which NGOs exist. Yes, we consider that NGOs can give you aid, NGOs can give you welfare, but NGOs also do things like capacity building and capacity development. NGOs carry out farmer training programs. NGOs teach you how to farm in arid areas like northern Ghana. NGO gives you seed and give you the mechanisms to be able to plow your land and be able to get benefits out of the ground for you to become independent. The idea that because there's a lot of proliferation of NGOs means that all the NGOs there only give you aid, except if that's the only thing they prove on the side of the house, that all the NGOs are going to give you aid. We can't buy that argument. What that means is that there's a form of capacity building that happens on outside of the house that allow people to rise up the social ladder and gain mobility and financial mobility that governments and states are unable to provide in that regard. I think my first extension directly clashes with closing government, and I think that's probably where the debate is going to start. They state that because of the proliferation of these NGOs, it makes the place, you're making noise, come on, man. It makes the place unattractive for investment. We think that that's a lie. The presence of low welfare services or weak NGO activity does not mean you have more investors coming. Like, this is basic fundamental economics in the real world. What investors are afraid of are things like insecurity, instability, and dysfunctional basic systems. Unfortunately, it is on our side of the house that you have NGOs fixing these preconditions for markets to be able to exist. So things like workers being healthy, things like education being available, things like basic infrastructures, and communities being stable. Given that everything in today's debate has already argued how this place has gotten a lot of neglect, it means that NGOs provide the precondition for investment to provide some kind of stability. Just with this, we have won the debate because we are upstream everything in today's debate. But let us continue the extension. We think that this guy's opening opposition does a great job to tell you why NGOs are important, which is why Raymond in his speech tells you about how NGOs help people to not die and provide aid and basic service. That's the extent of their argument. You have nothing else to vote on that. I think that would probably be a good argumentation if we're arguing about the existence of NGOs. Unfortunately, this is about the proliferation of NGOs. What does that look like? The amount of NGOs being there means a number of things. They are better able to coordinate things like service delivery in that regard, which is much more important. The reason why this is important
is that NGOs comes with a lot of things. Number one, expertise. Number two, skilled labor and skilled workforce. The reason why you have the capacity to buy this argument on the panel is because most of these NGOs are documented. That is why they are non-governmental organizations. Otherwise, you can just call them Henaku CP or any other name, and we probably think that would be their name. But because they are documented, they have incentives to be able to train people and deploy skilled workers within that regard. What is the impact of this? It means that with the presence of NGOs being there, there's a lot of documentation of the kind of services being given to those people. So if you provide vaccine, for example, or any kind of capacity building, you will document the training you offer to these people, the kind of vaccine you offer them, and ensure that it doesn't harm them. In the absence of the proliferation of these NGOs, what do you have? Undocumented individuals carrying out aid services that cannot be documented. Governments cannot track them. NGOs go through things like auditing. They are still held accountable for their own actions. That is why they document the things they do. For a place like northern Ghana that has faced a lot of humanitarian crises, we think that the only way you are able to have a lot of workforce being deployed there to insulate the gap that has been created by government is if you have a lot of these NGOs becoming substituting actors to the kind of services that the states are not willing to provide. We think that the alternative, as I've already provided, is service vacuums being created and undocumented civil societies and individuals carrying projects that harm individuals. This harm is something you don't get from the opposition. CG, let's go.
Yeah, so you rebut your major point in your first line when you say people hear NGOs and think charity. That is how it manifests. So maybe you are right. It's a perception thing which prevents the vast majority of people from thinking of them as viable investment facilities.
Let's assume it is true. Do we go with perception or what actually happens on the ground? If the debate is only about perception, then end the debate and give them the win. What happens is, what is currently happening with the proliferation of NGOs in northern Ghana, you have to prove that the only thing they give is one-time aid, and you can't prove that on your side of the house. I've already characterized that since there's a lot of NGOs there, there's even more propensity on our side to have a lot of NGOs or some NGOs carrying out long-term capacity building development. You can't win the debate with that silly argument. Let's contribute to the conversation of civic capacity and political agency. We think that, that's nothing to respond to accountability. All they say is that accountability is the new buzzword, and they don't think that these people have the capacity to get accountability for government. We think that that is not true for a number of reasons. These guys claim that the proliferation of NGOs means that you remove accountability from the people to hold the government accountable. We think that that is not true. We think that one of the greatest goods of NGOs is not just physical aid, as I've already characterized, which can exist in some instances, but the creation of things like organized citizenry, telling people how to carry out, for example, check-in mechanisms. How does this look like? It looks like before the boom of NGOs within northern Ghana, people did not have leverage because they do not have professionals that are able to teach them things like civic responsibility and local leadership. What the proliferation of these NGOs has done is that it has been able to train community-based organizations in things like grant writing, accountability, advocacy, monitoring, which means that you are better able to get accountability mechanisms that are structural and are much more better that the government can respond to on our side of the house as opposed to the silly thing you get from opening opposition. But more importantly, we think that these NGOs or their proliferation means that some of them can serve as third-party auditors. What does this look like? It means that they now are on-ground professional observers to the kind of acts that the government commits in status quo. That means if the government wants to intentionally carry out an act against its people, this professional observation makes it less likely for these things to be able to happen. Now, let us talk about why we beat them. We think the major concession that happens in the opening half is that opening government believes that they are against the proliferation because you take government accountability. This guy says NGOs and governments can still exist. We think that the proliferation of NGOs means that the rate of action is being done a lot faster and people can get accountability. Closing opposition.
Thank you very much for that speech. To end the debate on the government bench, let's welcome the government to KDO'.
All right. Apparently, yes. Oh, by your partner. Okay. Let's start now. Matthew explains to you that perception has impacts. It has impacts in the orientation of people both externally and internally. It has impacts on the orientation of businesses when they come into your place. It has impacts on the orientation of governments who have populist incentives to do what they think is most popular and most welcome. What does it tell you that the implication of the perception in this debate is? As a function of these people's thing, that is to say, for these NGOs to be able to get the funding they think it is so hard to get, we think there's a race to the bottom that usually happens. Matthew explains to you that the population or the concentration of NGOs in these spaces is so, excuse my French, is so freaking dense that they have to literally do extreme versions of marketing. They literally have to find ways of cracking the code to make themselves appear more and more attractive to the limited funding that exists. It means that as a function of that, and for their own thing on, oh, competition makes them better to be true, it means you have to believe that these people sell a certain type of messaging. What do we think is the type of messaging that they are most likely to tap into? It's two things. It's the poverty narrative. It's the thing that nobody has money, everybody's going hungry, everybody's dying thing. Why? First of all, because it's the path of least resistance. Anytime you are trying to persuade people, you do not use something that is hard for them to believe, use the thing that is easier for them to believe. So if Smart is right and there's a perception problem that makes African debaters debate it as if it is just handouts, then it is true also that these people likely tap into these things in the ways in which they do their marketing. So first of all, unlike the least part of resistance thing, that's it. But secondly also, genuinely, I do not understand what the comparative narrative that they sell to these people is on their side. Crucially, they needed to have explained that for that response to work. What does Matthew explain to you that the implication of this then is? Three things. Like the end point of this argument, essentially, because I may skip some of the things because you already have it in your notes, is that you end up creating a northern region that is structurally reliant on the benevolence of external people. You create a northern region that does not ever get to a point where it is able to independently self-sustain in three main ways. First of all, on investment and capital and the ways in which it shapes things like infrastructural development. Matthew tells you that what people who are investing look out for is three things. First of all, they look at the capital profile of the place. How many people can we get to pitch in for these things? Who would buy our product if we come and do these things? We think that the messaging structurally undermines that thing. Secondly, there's a skill problem also that the messaging affects. That is, say if I'm going to build a factory somewhere, I need to know that the people have basic literacy skills and can do these things. If the messaging or the literal idea that I have about a certain place is that most of the people are illiterate and they can't even have basic food, I do not consider them as a place where I can go and potentially create my car fabricating factories. Please sit for a second. So on skills too, the narrative affects the perception that they have the skills needed to sustain the investment, so investment won't go there. Thirdly, on security, when the place is literally the hungriest place possible and everybody's scraping at the minimum, nobody wants to send their money there, nobody wants to build their factories there because they'll probably loot it anyway, they'll probably come and steal the parts and go and sell it for cheap. Crucially then, the perception is bad for attracting investment. That's the first thing Mark explains to you. Second, on state orientation, I've already explained this thing when I was mentioning it. States simply are populist people. So the MP, you come and do the thing that he knows people are happy about and want anyway. If he knows that the thing that you people are already oriented toward is come and do some one scholarship scheme somewhere and do some, they are taking 5 girls to school thing, and that's it. He does that, overusing that same money to probably build a marketplace, more like ultra-modern marketplace where your people can have their products. He does that overbuilding a storage facility where you can go and store your cow meat. He does that overbuilding a storage facility where you can go and store your grains. Why is this bad? Because the comparative is one that is way more productive and would help you to self-sustain in the future so that you do not need him to keep coming back and doing these things, which means that you are less reliant on these things. The crucial way in here is that a lot of these things are dependent on global fluctuations. If Donald Trump decides tomorrow that he won't fund a lot of things anymore, a lot of these NGOs can no longer do these things, which means that the people dying are structurally worse on their side. State orientation is worsened. Finally, on the people themselves, Israel Smart says they train people in those places. Do you know the type of training they give them? They give them secretarial training. It's like when the white people came here, they said the white people gave our people, our forefathers education. Do you know what the education they gave them? They gave them secretarial education, catechism education. Why? Because that was what served their interest the most. An NGO does not need to train you in how to repair cars and teach you technical skills. All you need to teach you is how to like sign documents, clerical things. The thing Smart is telling me about. These are not things that facilitate productivity. We think that that is what is most important for these places.
Why they are asking that people perceive them as poor? They perceive that the cost of infrastructure and the cost of labor, and there is less competition. Why is the mechanism that the only thing they will do is not invest, even though there are significant opportunities?
Yeah, the only thing they would do is continually spending money on doing the things they perceive as the most acute problems in that place. The comparative Matthew explains to you is that when these things are not that much, and when the perception problem is not that strong, the call out these guys say would happen anyway on opposition is the thing that forces states then to do things that are way more structural in helping these things. That is what forces an MP to go and find somebody to come and help build a factory there so that the people who grow maize in his place can make some soya beans thing or something like that. Crucially, why is that debate winning? Because like I've explained to you, first of all, it's a sustainability thing. The sustainability thing is crucial because you tie your sovereign sustainability to fluctuations of things that are beyond your control. But secondly, also, the inability for it to self-sustain and grow beyond these things also is crucially bad. I think inherent in there we beat our opening because there's a clear path to how things get better on our side. On opposition, what I have structurally explained then is even in their best case scenario, the day funding goes out, immediately we die. What is their best case response? They say, oh, our side is sadistic because we need people to suffer first for solutions to emerge. Crucially, that is not true. Because we explained to you that the comparative, they themselves, their closing stresses, is not that there are no NGOs, it is that there are not that many NGOs who need to compete so hard that they do a regressive form of marketing about the place that tells people or that enhances or entrenches the stereotypes about these people that creates the problem Japan tells you about. Crucially, we break from this round because we are the team that has the most sustainable model of helping these people.
Thank you very much.
Oh, yeah.
For that speech to end the debate for us, let's follow the opposition with KDO'.
Sorry, 1 second. Yeah, sure, I'll take POIs. Okay. Sorry for the delay. I'll be starting my speech in 3. Yeah, thank you. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First on bench way up, what they give you is that proliferation exists out of necessity. People suffer more without this proliferation. Feasibility is achieved because people get to know what happens there and these individuals become independent. What we do is to recognize why those things are actually quite important, those primary individuals, why principally proliferation in of itself is essentially important. The first principle that SMART gives to you is that this proliferation is needed because multiple NGOs existing within the northern region leads to more coordinated mobility and in of itself skill set to actually enforce some proper catering for individuals within different areas of needs that these particular individuals have. Because we feel like within the northern hemisphere of Ghana, it's not just that these individuals are poor, uneducated, it's also environmental issues like things like climate change, their dry lands, and also agroeconomic issues within those particular places, which is the primary source of survival for these individuals. We think that numerous NGOs existing within these places, we have individuals that focus on things like education, individuals that focus on things like basic access, and other persons that assist farmers in their basic needs. That coordinated mobilization is because of the fact that there are massive researches and data collection happening within those areas, exclusive impact that you get from us. Secondly, we talk about civic capital and how we actually achieve some level of accountability through this proliferation agency. We tell you that most the individuals that exist within the proliferation of NGOs within this particular region leads to more exacerbated advocacy for the plight of these particular individuals, leads to more engagement and collective community building between the NGOs and members of these communities. Why this is particularly important? We create mechanisms in of itself that government can use to engage based on niche down research that they can actually use to assist these people if they want to, just like they said on that particular regard. They also consider the fact that these areas are largely neglected, so we don't understand how data in of itself makes sense when it is not niche down to the primary needs of these average persons. You get why that's important on our word. Lastly, we also give you an argumentation that weighs up on the first engagement from CG. We tell you how in of itself, if welfare, like the concept of welfareism, we see these people as welfare states in of itself, and that creates some level of stereotype that is problematic, and proliferation exacerbates that. Why is this not true? Proliferation of NGOs or not, these people are poor, they are underdeveloped. That is their natural status. So even if NGOs don't exist or government doesn't interfere, that is the way those regions exist. So people still perceive them as poor regardless of still. We don't see why they are better off on their side of the debate. What we do is to create room for capacity building for these individuals and increasing the knowledge of the things that are already wrong with them in that particular regard, exclusive impact you get from us. Let's go over CG on most of their materials, right? Because we already show you why we're winning over our open. Teaching materials. The first thing is that we create a niche industry, and I think the mechanism to justify is that they feel like this niche industry in of itself views these regions as welfare. I've already engaged why that in of itself is problematic. But secondly, niching can only be something that you put into consideration of itself if the person doing the niching is actually benefiting profitably or making some financial gain. These individuals pour in resources into the northern hemisphere of Ghana. They don't get any profit in return because they are not investors. So why is it that niching of itself is bad when the primary niching is for the sole purpose of providing welfare for those particular persons? They don't win us on that class. Secondly, they tell us that, oh, we make these individuals physically unattractive because proliferation of NGOs constantly make these individuals lose purchasing power in the minds of investors. Panel, regardless of whatever you want to believe in, investors only come into a region when there is one, massive government prioritization of the resources that come out of those regions, which is not what exists in status quo. Secondly, there is also some level of stability among individuals. Most of the regions within the northern hemisphere have tribal conflicts, have insecurities. Even if they have resources, people won't go there because there are external issues that exist outside the proliferation of NGOs. They don't show how they address that to even achieve the slightest benefit of even giving these individuals purchasing power in that regard. It's an illusion that doesn't exist. The last thing I know is that they tell you that internal problems between the individuals as stakeholders, that these individuals will not feel like they need to rely on scholarship, they need to rely on parenting before they become useful. This is a lie and unrealistic. Individuals that live within the northern hemisphere of Ghana are constantly migrating into other regions. You who are Ghanaians, this is practically your statistics. They're constantly migrating to Kumasi and Accra, seeking for better life because of their economic condition. So even if without proliferation of NGOs, they still have access to other regions for them to be profitable to themselves. So basically, because scholarships are available in Tamra, that means I'm not going to move to Kumasi if I have a good degree. That's not even redundant. That's very much redundant and unpractical. That's your POI.
There are poor people everywhere in Ghana. There are regional tensions everywhere in Ghana. Do you know why there's a unique stereotype to the northern? Because there's a specific and targeted marketing that has been considered over time that tags tax them as a unique bedrock.
That's not true. That market existed even before NGOs started coming to Ghana. You don't have a case on that. Firstly, on OG and obviously on why they're also losing to us. Within that, OG says that, oh, NGOs target minor things like economic investment, like agri investment, education, specific areas, and operate unlimited funding. Even if these targeted aids are minute, we think that they're important, because of the strategic positioning and environmental issues that individuals face within the North, We cannot leave this to government to decide in that particular regard, because governments in Ghana, even before they invest in things that are already accessible within the North, like things like agriculture, there must be some level of profitability within those particular sectors, which is why they don't go there. We know this is particularly problematic. NGOs proliferating in that particular region are a matter of urgency to address those particular things. Secondly, we don't think when OG argues that proliferation is harmful because it forces government to invest in the South and creates a false illusion that something is happening in North of itself, then there's some obligation that is created. This is false because we think that primarily, exclusively as an engagement, to align to what my partner gives you. Proliferation of NGOs in of itself is not just because government neglects them. We agree with them when they talk about grassroots engagement and their actors, but those primary political actors are incompetent. I don't want to act on the things that are finding problematic in those particular regions, exclusively showing that there are still structural issues that will exist even if NGOs stop being proliferation in that particular regard. Why is this primarily important? For this particular reason, we think that proliferation of NGOs in no particular regard act exclusively as neutral actors to address most of those fundamental issues, and like far away from things like structural incompetency and governmental issues that don't focus on what is essential for those people. Then lastly, they talk about, oh, foreign influence will come against these individuals and they'll start thinking like Western people, and that is so bad because we don't want them to start dressing like people in the West. That is extremely problematic. One, NGOs operate on a global scale, so they don't just employ one person from China, one person from US. There's a global communication system as to which they get skilled labor to assist people who are downtrodden. This is primarily important. And secondly, they are not states, for goodness sake. They are independent individuals that primarily created for the sole purpose of assisting people that need aid. They are not states that influence ideologies, and they are not states that implement or influence state constitutions. I don't see how you give that kind of superior power to NGOs when they don't have it in status quo. That's a lie. The next thing you need to understand, that panel, even if in of itself that is the worst case that will happen, that these people are largely influenced by foreigners and they lose their identity, etc., those individuals within the North are extremely antagonistic because of their religious and traditional beliefs, so they still have an incentive to protect themselves. They also don't win on the worst case scenario. The second thing they tell you is that, oh, data collection is a problem. We already show you why mobilization and capacity exists on outside, so we take them on that base case. And then they talk about proliferation being a reason why politicians are corrupting of when we give them an excuse to be corrupt. Corruption of itself is an asymmetry, can exist on both sides, but what word do you better reduce the effect of corruption on an average individual living in North? It's an our word when you encourage proliferation of persons that actually create for their welfare, exclusive of whatever it is. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This brings us to the end of the semi-final team cross-section, and thank you all to announce the results.
Okay, thank you.
You say for okay.